All right, I'm gonna just give everybody one more minute and then we're gonna kick it off just for the sake of time. We've got 2 presentations today, so I want to make sure we have enough time. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. My name is Lauren Lisi and I'm the manager of grants and research projects at NEFE. Thanks so much for joining today. We're really excited to have Lena Gann and Jack Kroger, 2 participants in the NEFE and Knology Fellowship Program, here to present their work using Knology's database and mapping tool. Jack is a PhD student at the in policy analysis at the Pardee Rand Graduate School, an assistant policy researcher at the Rand Corporation. Jack's project expands on existing research on state financial education mandates by assessing the longer-term effect that financial education in high school has on future difficulties repaying debts borrowed for education. Lena is a PhD student with the Department of Personal Financial Planning at Kansas State University, and her study examines the relationships between investments in education, health status, having children, financial literacy, and financial well-being. We plan to save 5 to 10 minutes at the end of each presentation for Q&A and ask that you save questions for then. When the time comes, the best ways to ask a question are to either raise your hand virtually, and the host will unmute you to ask your question directly to our presenters. We will unmute folks in the order that we receive raised hands. Alternatively, you can also type questions into the chat box and we will answer in the order that they are received. Please refrain using the chat feature before then, just to not distract our presenters. I will also drop a link in the chat to a short survey at the end of the second Q&A time. This survey is meant to provide feedback on the webinar today, and we really value your thoughts and suggestions. It should take no more than a couple minutes to complete, and we really appreciate you doing so. I think that's it. With that, I'll hand it over to Sean Field from Knology to kick us off.
Thanks, Lauren. Hi, everybody. My name is Sean Field, and I'm a researcher at Knology. Knology is a social science research think tank based in New York City with a mission to produce practical social science for a better world. Just a quick introduction to the project. In 2019, Knology won a research award from NEFE called A New History of Investment in Financial Education Across the United States. This project aimed to assess the impact of financial education investment by states and nonprofits on individual behaviors. Through this project, we put together a database that includes data on student exposure to relevant academic content standards, as well as nonprofit program service expenses and measures in the Survey of Household Economics and Decision-Making, known as the SHED colloquially. Knology's original research plan focused on understanding the return on investment of state mandates for financial education by looking at individual economic security outcomes captured in the SHED. The database was then put to use by 6 fellows in 2022, 2 of whom are here today, each of whom took a different approach to understand the impact of mandates, frameworks, and public and private investment on financial decision-making. You'll hear from both Jack and Lena on their projects today. After the webinar is complete, I will send out an email with resources, including how to access the database, our spending mapping tool, and a webinar discussing how you too can use the database yourself in your research. Thank you all for joining, and Jack, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean and Lauren, for the introduction and for allowing me to be part of the fellowship. It's been terrific, and I'm happy to see some fellow participants here online as well. So as Lauren was saying, I studied the effect of state financial education mandates on educational debt outcomes, particularly looking at longer term outcomes. So my main research question was, what effect, if any, do financial education mandates have on the ability of those with educational debt to be able to pay off their loans? And in particular, I looked at one question found in the SHED, which asked if if borrowers were falling behind on their educational debt, or if their debt had entered into collections. So I looked at the likelihood that an individual who took on educational debt in a state would fall behind on their payments in the future, given receiving financial education in high school or not. I do find some evidence for an effect that the financial education mandates had, with a much stronger effect for those who had in the moderate range of self-reported financial well-being. So some quick background and motivation for this question. I was originally interested in asking this question as student debt payments were set to resume for borrowers with federal debt. I think at the time it was set to resume at the end of August. Then it was pushed back to the beginning of next year, and now it's been pushed back even further to the middle of June. So hopefully by the time I can disseminate some of this and share the results and get feedback and everything, well, it just keeps getting pushed back anyways. But that was my motivation. I wanted to understand what policies may help borrowers who are at risk of falling behind or entering into collections on their student debt, particularly as there was a new range of borrowers who might be entering into payments for the first time, or making payments again, resuming payments again for the first time in over 2 years. I was also interested in the effectiveness of financial education mandates on these borrowers. There's been evidence on other debt behaviors, but less so on kind of this one specific variable, and for this one specific subgroup. And if any findings were true for the full range of borrowers, or if there were kind of differential effects for different types of borrowers. So I was motivated by some past research which has examined financial education mandates impacts on debt behaviors. These have found that in general, these mandates and the financial education that they provide have been shown to decrease non-student debt and delinquent balances on that non-student debt. They've reduced the likelihood of using payday loans. And then most relevantly, I think for my specific study, a paper by Stoddard and Urban found that they increased the likelihood of applying for student aid, and they shifted some of that borrowing toward lower cost sources of financing. So one interesting thread to pull on is to see if that increase, if that shift towards lower cost financing also has an impact as well down the road once people enter into repayment, as a particular mechanism. I had trouble testing that with the data available, but that's something I'd like to look into more in the future. Okay, so how did I go about testing those questions? I used data from the SHED and from Stoddard and Urban on state financial education mandates to set up a difference in difference model using two-way fixed effects. So here I show the model. Y is the outcome of interest. It's the dummy equal to 1 if an individual in the SHED data is either behind on their student debt payments or in collections. And then the treatment variable is the FinEd variable, which is 1 if they turned 18 in a state that put into effect a financial education mandate in the year prior to them turning 18. So age 18 was used as a measure of graduate year. That's a little standard in this research, but it is an assumption. Not everyone graduates when in the year they turn 18. Some graduate before, after, but hopefully on average it evens out. I then also include a vector of individual level control variables and a vector of state level control variables, in addition to fixed effects for the state, the year, and a graduation year cohort. So some that should control for most time varying characteristics given the repeated cross-sectional nature of the data, as well as kind of the the shifting unemployment and GDP figures that may be associated with hardship paying off debt and would vary over time within a state. Given recent research on potential issues with difference and differences with staggered treatment, I also ran a stacked two-way difference and difference model to help address some of those issues. I do find some evidence for treatment of heterogeneity over time, which I show with kind of event study style graphs towards the end. Cool. So a bit more on the data and the variables that I used. Like I mentioned, I used data from the survey of how I used data from the shed, and it's all available for all years in the Knology data set. And I used a question that was asked. The wording was identical in both periods, other than one detail. It was asked as two separate questions. Are you behind? And then a separate question, are you in collections in 2013? But then it was consistent in all other years. So I have data from 2013 to 2019. I then took a sample of all of the shed respondents aged 22 to 30 in the survey years who graduated high school and report having educational debt. So that yielded a total sample size of about 3,100. And then, yeah, another important caveat is that educational debt was measured only for those who had debt for their own education. So I wanted to focus on people who were making some decisions about whether or not they were taking debts at the outset to see if there was that kind of outset effect. Something for future research I might look into is looking at those who do not have debt for their own education, but do have debt for someone else's education, to see if them having financial education has an effect on that, but that the sample is much smaller for that group in particular, and I'm not sure this method would work in that case. The treatment variable is the state mandate requiring completing financial education in play prior to graduation. So I talked about the key assumption is that they're age 18. And then finally, the dependent variable is a binary variable for whether an individual is behind on student debt payments or in collection. On the right, I have a quick balance table, which shows that the samples are mostly balanced. The control and the treatment samples in this case are mostly balanced. You can see that there is there's about a 3 percentage point difference in the likelihood of being behind on your student debt in the treatment group, which lends just kind of cursory evidence that, like, at the outset, this is something we see, that's the pattern we see. They're slightly less likely, it's statistically significant, but we would like to control for other factors that might be causing that decline. Otherwise, the groups look fairly similar. One distinction to call out is that the treatment group mean was a bit lower, statistically significantly lower than the control mean age, but this difference is slight, and I think I control for it well through the graduation cohort fixed effects. Alrighty, so this figure just shows the sample that I used. It shows all shed respondents from 2013 to 2019, and then it blocks out the specific group that I look at. So I'm just focusing on this one group of respondents. It's not evenly split between treatment and control status, but it's a good size of each. Cool. Move on to some results. So here we have the overall results running my main specification, which is column 2, as well as kind of a naive difference in difference model that didn't include covariates, but still included all of the fixed effects, and the same two models again with a logistic regression model instead of a Gaussian model. I'll mostly be talking about the Gaussian model because the interpretation is a little bit easier, but I do have odds ratios if people are interested as well in the logistic regression model. But the findings are consistent across each type. If something's statistically significant in one, it always is in the other, and vice versa. If it's not, it's not. So this, we find that in the overall sample, after including covariates, there was about a 5.5% decline in the likelihood of falling behind or entering in collections for your student debt, given that an individual graduated high school from a state that had a financial education mandate. So that's statistically significant at the 5% level. And it's a fairly sizable effect relative to the average for the entire group, which is about a 13% chance of falling behind. We find similar results for the logistic regression model as well. Cool. Okay, so one other, in addition to having an overall results, I also wanted to do some subsample analyses. So looking at the difference in effects based on self-reported levels of financial well-being. So for that, I looked at differences in the effects, based on this one question that was consistently asked between 2013 and 19, asking individuals to describe how well they're managing financially these days. So it's a bit of a vague question. People are given 4 options, whether they're finding it difficult to get by, just getting by, doing okay, and living comfortably. What I wanted to do is to split out, basically my hypotheses here were that those living comfortably, the effect of financial education is likely, or is not less important, but it's less likely to have a meaningful impact on the margins for those individuals. They're generally doing fine, paying off their loans. They're making enough money to quote unquote live comfortably, or they're have enough money saved to live comfortably at the moment. So I basically did a subset analysis excluding those individuals. And then within that subset, I looked at the difference between those doing okay and then the bottom 2 groups who are just getting by or finding it difficult to get by. And that worked out to about, each worked out to about a third of the total sample. I also did some analyses expanding my age categorization, because it was a little bit of the decision on the low end to start at 22 made sense to me, because that is for 4-year graduation track for undergrad. That makes sense. It's when most people start to re-enter payments, but I did want to look to see if there was kind of, for those not attending the traditional 4-year undergrad, doing kind of trade school or an associate's degree or something else that they're borrowing for, if it had an impact in expanding up to 35 or 40. That at those ages, the effects kind of wash out. They're no longer significant. They're usually lower than the main sample that I looked at. So I'm happy to share about those results or talk more about them if people have questions as well, but I'll get into this subsample analysis first right now. So first, this is the subsample who did not report that they are living comfortably. So it's all but those about 500 individuals. Here I've boxed out the main finding again, which is from the normal difference in difference model with all the covariates, and the effect now is about a 9.1% decrease in the likelihood of falling behind. So it is now larger. It's still statistically significant, which lends some evidence to the fact that the effect is isolated in these individuals, in the sample who are not living comfortably, who don't have the highest ranking of potential financial well-being, even after controlling for income and other factors. So that was interesting to me. The increase was interesting. And then the results, which I don't have shown, but for just the group that said they are living comfortably was much smaller. The sign actually reversed here, interestingly, but it was not distinguishable from 0. And yeah, it was just kind of too small of a sample to like truly trust that it's a valid result, but it was kind of the opposite of this, which is what you would expect. Then after this, I didn't have a great theory about if the effects of financial education would be greatest for those doing okay or for those who are just getting by or struggling to get by. I think based on past research, I had different ideas, but I did, once looking at those groups, and here I've only reported just the main results with the covariates. I did find again, statistically significant effect for the group that report doing okay, and then a noisy null effect for the struggling sample. So these each are about half of the remaining sample. So this lends some evidence to me that there is a greater effect for those doing okay than those who report that they're struggling to get by financially, and that the effect is again larger. It's now about a 12.8% decrease in the likelihood of falling behind or entering into collections. Yeah, I think similar results again into Logit, that they tend to always mirror the main Gaussian results, but are sometimes the odds ratios are fairly extreme. Sorry. Okay. I'll sit here for a second. I forgot my notes. Anyways, sorry about that. The effect is large. To me, this indicates that there's kind of a marginal effect of financial education that isn't superseding financial hardship. If someone is struggling to get by, the financial education they received in high school is not going to overcome like a lack of income to pay student debt, at least not on its own, which I think potentially has policy implications about financial education mandates as well as other policies around student debt. However, for this sample that is doing okay, I think there is strong evidence that financial education could help support them in not falling behind on their debt payments. And that for both of these groups, at least in the shed sample that I looked at, they are sizable chunks of the total amount of borrowers. And they're collectively about 3/4 of the sample, but also individually then about each about half of that 3/4. Okay, cool. So one potential issue with my identification strategy that I wanted to look into is that staggered treatment within the sample and differential timing from treatment to survey response could bias the treatment effects that I'm estimating. So the Goodman-Bacon has research on this about forbidding comparisons between early treated and late treated, as well as never treated and early treated. So here I've just mapped out kind of all the respondents in the treatment states. So these are respondents in states that ever implemented a financial education mandate and where in my sample they fell in terms of time from treatment. So if they graduated high school in 2018 and the state implemented a financial education mandate in 2015, they would be a 3 in this third bar here. So you can see there's kind of a range, pretty well represented range all the way up to about 12 years post-treatment that we're observing individuals, as well as about 15 or 16 years pre-treatment. So I wanted to check that my findings were robust to some potential comparisons that are happening within the difference in difference method. So I implemented a two-stage difference in difference method outlined by Gardner in a paper from 2021. So I'll speed up. Those results were similar in magnitude to my previous results. However, now only the subset that are doing okay are statistically significant at the at any level. And the full sample, the sign has now flipped, but it's indistinguishable from zero. So this lends some evidence that there might be issues with the original difference in different types of models for this question. Other research has also found that there are heterogeneous treatment effects for education mandates over time, so that wasn't super surprising to me. However, the strength of this finding for the doing okay sample was I was surprised by personally after originally seeing the other ones. And it's also similar in magnitude. And then in addition to that, I'm sorry, this is a bit of an eye test, but I did produce event study estimates that show some of that treatment effect heterogeneity. So again, the treatment effects are all post-zero, and the doing okay sample is shown in the bottom graph, and the subset that is don't report doing comfortably are reported in the top graph. You can see that there are appear to be larger effects earlier on. So the closer you were to when you answered the survey to when you graduated high school, the more likely there was to be a large effect of financial education mandates on your likelihood of falling behind on your debt. And that kind of decreases slowly over time for this doing okay sample, but is still significant even 10 years out. Here with the later stages, you start to get into issues of sample size. Cool. So finally, my last few minutes here, I wanted to talk a little bit about the relevance of the findings, potential mechanisms that might be accounting for them. I've alluded to some earlier. So one mechanism that could be in play is better, quote unquote, better, lower cost initial borrowing decisions by student debt borrowers. So there is evidence of that in the research to date. I think that that's a good mechanism that should be explored further. Another potential mechanism is increased knowledge of repayment options down the road. So if financial education is introducing different payment options in high school, that might be particularly salient for borrowers, and they might remember those discussions or have resources from those classes that they then pull on in the future, or they at least know that that is something that they should be thinking about when they enter into repayment. So there might be better use of income-based repayment, or just greater use of income-based repayment, or other mechanisms that are available to help borrowers. One other thing that I explored, and this actually might be a weakness of the paper as well, or the study, is that there is, if mandates crowd in other investment for around financial education. So I just have like a really brief descriptive graph of total nonprofit spending by nonprofits that the Knology team flagged as being related to financial education in the treatment states and in the control states that I observed. It's not really it's hard to do the time series with the comparison because not every state implemented the treatment in the same year, but you do see a big increase before and then around 2008 in the treatment states that isn't observed in the non-treatment states. So first of all, that could present kind of endogeneity issues where the policy is being driven by external factors, but also the policies in some cases could be driving this increase in nonprofit spending, which I then think is potentially a mechanism that is helping borrowers in those states in the future when they have access to other nonprofits in the area who might be giving them information on student debt repayment options. Cool. And then finally, on some policy issues, the fact that the effects are largely isolated to those who are who report doing okay or in that moderate range of financial well-being, indicate possible shortcomings of existing financial education. There might need to be better targeting for those who of how to address student debt and repayment options for those who are falling behind. They might not be receiving the support they need, and the need for other policies aimed at those borrowers who are currently behind. So there's student options such as student debt forgiveness, or other policies such as easing repayment requirements, making it easier to discharge in bankruptcy. A lot of solutions that have been pitched and encouraged by the current administration. It would be interesting to study how some of those advance going forward. So I think that's my time. Thanks all for listening. I'll pass it back to Lauren for any Q&A.
Yeah, just a reminder that you can either raise your hand and I will unmute you to ask your question, or you can drop any questions you have in the chat and we'll answer those verbally. I have a question actually for maybe some of the non-research audience here. Wondering if you could talk about just in the data set how the categories like struggling to get by or doing okay financially or whatever, how is that defined? Is that something that people self-identify as, or is there like parameters to define some of those categories?
Sorry, I think I cut out at an inopportune time. Which categories?
Just like the categories you talked about, like struggling financially, doing okay. Just wondering, like, is that something people self-identify as in the survey, or are there like parameters to kind of group people into those categories?
Yep, I did go and look to see if there were some like vignettes available for people taking the surveys. It's just purely as far as I could tell, self-identification. I think that's one limitation of this, is that was self-identification. And then I debated going in and creating different income categories, but I was already controlling for income categories in my regressions. So it's kind of how comparable are those results then to the earlier results where you're controlling for income, was a question I had. So this is like, within a given income category, how someone would rate their finances. I think there also might just be like measurement error involved there, where someone who reports doing really well financially might not. It's a risk I consider, is that they, I don't know, like blissful ignorance of their financial scenario is one case, or they just go and they then like check no on everything else down the rows.
Definitely appreciate that. Looks like we got another question. Just to read it out loud. Did you look at any prior research on the memorability of high school required financial education to better inform your suggestion that payment plan education be implemented in high school to prepare borrowers for decision making? As a financial educator in higher ed, that information is available and pushed at many levels when it is arguably more relevant, and alumni and former students still struggle with understanding their options and taking action.
I didn't, outside of a few pieces that studied that. So that's a great suggestion for kind of my ongoing research, is to look at more of that on the memorability. I did see a couple papers not particularly related to financial education, but related to what were they about? Well, I'm not going to talk about something that I can't remember well. But yes, in my literature briefly on kind of like salience of information when making financial decisions, kind of from the behavioral finance side, but not so from the education side. So that is something I'll look into.
Looks like we got one more question and then we'll pass it along to Lena. Have you looked into the government mandate in each state in terms of the grace period? Because some states might allow schools to have time to adapt this new rule or mandate education for new students, not the existing ones as part of the graduation requirement.
Yep. I have the list. I didn't do any kind of robustness checks yet, but it is on my agenda to do those. Yeah, the Knology team has a great kind of list of all the documentation in their data set with the mandates. And so then it's just making a list account for the grace period. I haven't done that yet, but it is kind of one issue I have with this identification strategy and with this identification strategy, even with that in general, is that the rollout and the implementation could look very different across schools, depending on resources available to them, and kind of individual teacher motivation and other factors that even with all the controls in the world are very hard to control for. But one thing that I can do is account for grace periods, which I plan to do.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jack. Let's turn it over to Lena.
I will stop sharing.
Perfect.
There we go.
Hi, everyone. Aloha from Hawaii. My name is Lena, and I reside in Hawaii, even though I'm a PhD student at Kansas State University. I want to thank all the staff at NEFE as well as Knology for the help and my colleagues for their feedback during this journey. I am a first generation college student, an immigrant, an ethnic minority. But today I am a PhD student and I'm a NEFE fellow. And I share this story because my parents never went to college, but my daughter just graduated. She has no student debt and she's happily working in Boston. So my research interest is really on underrepresented minorities and the low-income households. Based on my personal narrative and my motivation, my research topic today is examining the relationship between human capital investments and financial well-being among at-risk households using the SHADE for the past 9 years. Well, there are many empirical studies that show that higher education is a champion of better opportunities and economic growth. There's no doubt about it, and that's what we know about traditional human capital. However, some studies pertaining to lower income households also show that increases in human capital investments, again, college education, improves the economic well-being of households. They also improve self-efficacy and optimism. But in my research, I found that other than college education, Americans actually spend quite a lot of money in other human capital investments. For example, last year, Americans spent about $3.9 trillion on health consumption, $12.8 billion on just vitamins, $11 billion on self-help industry. And on average, they spend about $300,000 raising a child. So I decided to expand on the traditional human capital investments to include not just formal education, but experience, health, and the number of children as key predictors. As a proxy for experience, I use financial literacy based on Sandra Houston's definition, which is actually the know-how and the application of the know-how. So in other words, it's not just having a bank account, for example, it's also knowing how the account can help you save on taxes and using that particular information to apply. The two main research questions in this study is, well, how does human capital investments, as we've mentioned, affect financial well-being? And does financial literacy moderate between higher education and financial well-being? So the SHADE is one of the few public data sets that oversamples moderate to low income households. The other Federal Reserve data set that I've used, called the Survey of Consumer Finance, or the SCF, oversamples the wealthy. So therefore, this data set is very appropriate because it's looking at the at-risk population. I want to extend my gratitude to Knology, especially to Sean for being so helpful in compiling the data sets for the past 9 years. My households in this study are ones that have the SNAP, the WITC, or the housing assistance to indicate low income. And for my analysis, I used binary logistic regression, and for robust check, I used the multinomial regression. So this is my conceptual framework. As Jack has mentioned, there are 40 categories of financial well-being, and it's based on a single measure of a question. So it is self-reported, and there are some other quantitative studies on life satisfaction that also uses just one single measure. So for me, for this particular study, the single measure was appropriate. So basically, the households or the head of households are asked this question: which of the following best describes how well you're managing financially these days? And the key variables of human capital investments, as I mentioned earlier, is education, financial literacy, health, number of kids, and I use control variables as well. The next two slides are going to show the financial well-being broken down by income and race. And the reason I use it is because a number of empirical studies tend to show that these are the two strongest predictors of financial well-being. So you can see, as we've assumed, the higher income you have, the higher levels of financial well-being is expected. For those who earn more than 100,000 per annum, you can see that the living comfortably is quite a large portion of the pie. However, if you look at the $25,000 to $50,000 in annual income and compared to people making less than $24,000, that seems to be quite an interesting finding, where people who were making less reported living comfortably. So maybe income has some association with financial well-being, but not the total association or explanation. So financial well-being by race, you can see, I found it quite interesting to see that for the white households, it tends to be a U shape of the extreme. So living comfortably and difficulty getting by were in the highest, and the range in between was the lower ones. And then for the Black households, they reported more, the pattern looks more like a little hump, which is in the maroon color. And they have a slight raise in the middle, and then they slump down to difficulty getting by. For the Hispanic households, they tend to be more even in their distribution of self-reporting of financial well-being. So let's look at the key variables. As predicted, those with higher education, which is bachelor's degree or postgrad, tend to report living comfortably. Those with some college tend to report lower financial well-being than those with high school and below. So it could indicate perhaps that people with student loan debt has an effect on financial well-being, but they don't yet enjoy the benefits of households with college degree. I also found that people with higher level of health status tend to report living comfortably or doing okay. If you compare those with fair or poor health status, you can see the difference in the level of financial well-being. Here is an interesting snapshot. Those with kids tend to report living comfortably, which is not what I expected, because there are some studies that support having children create additional burden on the economic well-being of households. As for financial literacy, we expect to find that those with higher levels of financial literacy reporting higher levels of financial well-being. Here is an interesting snapshot. What if you had lower levels of educational attainment, which is high school and below, or even some college, but you had a higher level of financial literacy? So I highlighted it in red, that those with higher levels of financial literacy, but only had some college, high school or below, were reporting living comfortably. Well, you can think about it this way. It may not be unusual, because when you think of billionaires like Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, they never finished college, yet they definitely have high levels of financial literacy. So this is my multinomial model. The binary model actually showed the fit statistics. About 11% of the model was explained by the variance, and 74% of the model was accurately predicting which households were living comfortably and which were not. But I decided to do a multinomial regression because it had fewer predictors, but the McFadden R-squared increased to 14%, so there was a slight improvement in model fit. And what was more interesting about this analysis was the nuances in comparing different households. So you can see that those who reported excellent health versus poor health, which is the reference, actually has 13.8 times more likely to report living comfortably versus difficulty getting by. It was also 2.8 times more likely to report living comfortably than doing okay, and 5.9 times more likely to report living comfortably than just getting by. So what does that mean? It shows that health status has a huge effect size on financial well-being. And if you look at education, having bachelor's degree and a postgraduate has some of the effects, but those with financial literacy has a stronger effect size, and there are some interaction effects as well. So here are 3 of the significant findings in the study in a snapshot. Number 1, the multinomial analysis produced more meaningful results than using just the binary analysis. Health is a significant predictor across all categories of financial well-being. So, for example, better health is associated with higher levels of financial well-being. Second, financial literacy is a moderator for higher education and financial well-being. In other words, higher financial literacy strengthens the effect of higher education when it's associated with higher levels of financial well-being. And finally, financial literacy matters more than educational attainment. As you can see, someone with high financial literacy and some college is 90% more likely to report living comfortably versus difficulty getting by. But if he or she has high financial literacy and a bachelor's degree, the probability increases. He is now 10.6 times more likely to report living comfortably than difficulty getting by. So there are 4 implications for this study. Those with college, bachelor's, or postgraduate have a positive relationship with financial well-being, even for households who are living comfortably versus those in the rest of the categories. So I would argue that financial educators, college counselors should continue to encourage students to go to college and finish college, even though recent studies and reports have shown that college enrollment has declined. I still think that going to college is still a good thing. Second, financial literacy is important. As we have seen, higher levels indicate higher financial well-being. Third, there is synergy when you combine financial literacy and higher education, which is why the argument to promote financial literacy in high school is a very strong one. Finally, having good health is key in achieving higher levels of financial well-being. So some of the limitations in this study include using a cross-sectional data. Using a longitudinal data to measure the impact and make comparisons on time would be a little bit more stronger. Well, future research will also need to be conducted on larger population. And defining and measuring financial literacy was still hard to ascertain. I've only used 7 measures. We need to have also more information on external factors which were not available in the data set, such as financial shocks, changes in life circumstances to model the effects for at-risk households. So my conclusion for my study is this: know more, not just college, but financial literacy, so that you can do better in life and live well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Lena. Any questions? Looks like we got one in. Andrea says, for the sub 25K populations that are reporting living comfortably, did you find evidence of public aid usage like Medicare, SSI, SNAP, etc., that may be covering basic needs and contributing to financial well-being? That was our first question. She has another one, but let's address that one first.
Thank you for those questions. Unfortunately, I do not have sufficient information in the data set to show that there was evidence of people who actually, as you mentioned, covering the basic needs and contributing. Yeah, I only use households. My subsample was only households that actually had the SNAP and the public assistance. And I think you're absolutely correct. I should do more bivariate analysis. Then I can see for the lower income, which is the $25,000 and below, whether there was some overlap. So I think hopefully that would answer some of the nuances. And then the secondly was, yes, for health, you're absolutely correct. There is definitely some correlation with higher cost and medical debt. Again, with the data set, we have very limited information. So there is not a lot of what we call amounts that they spent in terms of dollars. It's just questions like, do you have medical insurance, for example? And so then from there, I can infer that they were covered for their medical cost. And that definitely does have an impact on their financial well-being.
Any other questions? I'm going to go ahead and drop a link in the chat to the survey for this webinar. We again really appreciate you taking the time to fill this out. Should take no more than 2 minutes. But still open for questions for Lena. Well, if there are no more questions, I'm just going to go ahead and let you all know that the next 2 fellows will be presenting their work not until the new year. We have the next webinar scheduled for January 25th at 2:30 p.m. Mountain Time. If you received an email about this one, you'll receive an email about that one. You can find more information about it on our social channels, and I'll follow up with the group closer to that date to just send a link and let you all know that's happening. Again, if there's no more questions, I think we can go ahead and end this webinar. Thank you again, Lena and Jack, for your presentations. It was really interesting. And thank you, Sean, for introducing the grant and for your work on this fellowship program. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Thank you.